Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another edition of Northshire Live. I'm Rachel Person. I'm the event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Saratoga Springs, New York. Here, as I so often am these days, with my friend and colleague, Davith Wood, event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Manchester, Vermont. Before we get started with our event this evening, a couple of very quick notes. First of all, you probably noticed as you came in that this evening's event is being recorded for future broadcast on our YouTube channel. However, fear not, we have the settings arranged so that it is only recording those of us who are unmuted and in the little yellow box that you see around me right now. So as long as you stay muted, you will not be part of that recording for perpetuity. In light of that, please use the chat to ask any questions at all that you have this evening. You can post questions in the chat at any point throughout the evening. Davith and I will save them up and we will pose them for you at the end of the night. So make use of that chat liberally. And then last of all, before I turn things over to Davith to introduce our wonderful guest this evening, a note of thanks. It's been long, hard, strange stretch of months and year and a half now at this point in the world of independent bookselling. And we really couldn't have kept doing what we do at Northshire without the incredible loyalty and support of our customers. It's meant a huge amount to us and it's made events like this possible. So thank you so much for everything that you've done to help us stay in existence throughout this rough time. And then without further ado, Davith, why don't you introduce our guest tonight?
Thanks so much, Rachel. It is my great pleasure to introduce Jeff Danziger for his new book, Lieutenant Dangerous. Danziger is one of the leading political cartoonists of his generation. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Vermont Digger, and other publications. And his cartoons are syndicated by the Washington Post Writers Group. He is a winner of the 2006 Herblock Prize for editorial cartooning, among many numerous other awards. And John le Carré said that Jeff Danziger is everything a great political cartoonist should be in this over-referential age. Savage, merciless, ribald, and blessed with a lovely eye and hand. His new book, Lieutenant Dangerous, a Vietnam War memoir, has been called funny, biting, thoughtful, and wholly original by Tim O'Brien, author of those things we carry. It is a Northshire staff pick by bookseller Mike Hare, who said that revealing his firsthand experiences with sharp insight and dark humor, Danziger depicts a bumbling, bureaucratic, bullying Vietnam-era army that left deep scars on a foreign countryside and on America's military, culture, and history. And we are very lucky to be joined tonight by another acclaimed Green Mountain cartoonist, Ed Koren. Edward Koren has been long associated with the New Yorker magazine, where he has published over 1,000 cartoons, as well as numerous covers and illustrations. His latest collection is Koren in the Wild, and you can see that in the chat box there. Please join me in welcoming to Northshire, Ed Koren and Jeff Danziger. Jeff, why don't you tell us about Lieutenant Dangerous?
Sorry? Okay.
I was going to say, why don't you tell us a little bit about Lieutenant Dangerous?
Well, I should begin by telling you about the title. I was a soldier in the Vietnam War. I was not dangerous. I tried to stay out of the infantry by going to a year-long language school in the Army, the Defense Language Institute. And when I got over to Vietnam, I was assigned as an artillery repair officer, about which I knew nothing. I was also assigned several Vietnamese translators, people from the ARVN who knew of English, and the idea was that, well, we would all get together and decide what things meant. They had trouble pronouncing my last name, Danziger. And so it came out Danziger or something like that. And they finally decided on the English word dangerous. And so I was known as Lieutenant Dangerous, but it didn't have anything to do with me being a danger to anyone except maybe myself.
Well, if I may jump in here and give a tribute to my colleague and friend, Jeff, and to think of his Army service as being basically basic training for his later career as a cartoonist and for a wonderful stylist, a verbal and stylist as well as a visual one, which of course are the two components of cartooning. But in this memoir that you've written, Jeff, it's just stunningly fluid and revealing. And but I was thinking too that your experience in Vietnam and what you describe in this memoir really is a kind of school for cartooning and school for social satire, because you encountered the worst of human nature and the best of the social comedy, in a funny way, and or the military comedy, which really kind of gave you the chops and the motivation to be the wonderful social commentator you are today. All those qualities are now every day drawn on by your genius.
We seem to be a different people over there. You know, during World War II, Stars and Stripes, which was the GI newspaper, daily newspaper, had a cartoonist. His name was Bill Malden. He was the best there was, and he had a kind of a American, tough-minded but forgiving sense of humor. He drew beautifully, and when I got over to Vietnam, I thought, well, they must have somebody doing that here because it was so popular with the troops. Well, they didn't have that, and they pretty much had rules against anybody making fun of the war effort, and so it all went underground. At least in Stars and Stripes in World War II, it wasn't underground. It was right out there for you to see. You had to have a sense of humor in order to prevent yourself from going crazy. But I think cartooning, in fact, is good as a writer. It pushes you to say what you have to say, get it done, get it out there, and then maybe have a secondary humorous comment to make at the same time.
But let me interrupt by saying your literary and visual connectivity in your cartoons is absolutely essential and perfect. I mean, it's the compression of what you write and what you draw is all part and parcel of the same piece.
Well, thank you. I do try to. I love to write. I'd rather be writing than reading, which is sort of egocentric, I suppose. Anyway, I think most cartoonists actually are good writers, for the simple reason that in a cartoon you do a scene, you put in people, and you make them talk. And if you write the same way, you actually do become a good writer and a good storyteller. So there's an urge to do that, and it's some good rules to follow just in writing. Yeah.
Well, and on the storytelling, pursuing that, your storytelling about the war and how you negotiated it and what your experiences were tremendously revealing and wonderfully written. And it's quite gripping to know that you did all these things and you described them with a kind of equanimity that flies in the face of what you were actually experiencing. It was just quite an incredible feat.
Well, these experiences came at you. The first thing you saw, and I was writing this in the book, the first thing you saw when you got off the plane in Saigon at Tan Son Nhut Airport with your helmet and your rifle and everything else was a huge sign that said, "You have a friend at the Chase Manhattan." And so if you had any doubts before that as to who was running this war and who had their hand on the wheel, it was removed there. I was also writing about the early training there, where I befriended a doctor who should not have been there in a war at all. He was a young man, and they would give you training that they couldn't do back in the States, which was to expose you to different kinds of explosions. The sound of our artillery going out made a different sound than the sound of their mortars coming in or rockets or anything. And so they would put you in the stands, and then the show would be these different types of explosions. And the poor man, he was nervous to start with. He didn't want to be there. He owed the Pentagon some money, I guess, and so they made him sign up for some additional years. And he was reduced to not just to tears, he was reduced to jelly And finally I interceded, and I went and told the people there, I said, this guy's he's not gonna make it through a month, even though he was a trained doctor. And then one day he disappeared. I think I might have gotten credit for that.
Well, Jeff, let me ask you about what you've written, what you wrote, which about dread, because this is towards the end of the book, just as you were about to leave Vietnam. You were a short timer. You had only a few weeks or a few days left, and you were sent on this mission to the Laotian border, and with some translators, Vietnamese translators you said at that point it was actually terrifying what you described, but you also said it was the first time during the war that you experienced dread. And I was just wondering about that, because you described earlier so many other situations which would have engendered dread, but why that one?
Because you owe them a year in country, 1 year. Mm-hmm. And if you got close to the end of your year, you were referred to as short. Mm. At that point, I was down to less than 2 months, or maybe even less than a month, and I realized that it would really be terrible if I lasted through this entire year there, and then got killed or blown up or in a helicopter wreck in the last month. This did happen to some people who got very, very sadly and almost made it through this experience and came out the other end and were killed right at the end. So that was my dread. It was an operation called Operation Lam Son. It was up near the border of South Vietnam with Cambodia, in an area that was one of the places where the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail came through, and the Air Force had bombed the Ho Chi Minh Trail with a tonnage of bombs total that was greater than all of the bombs dropped by all parties in the entire Second World War, which is an amazing figure. When you realize that, and what they should have realized, that bombing doesn't work. It only makes people mad. And then they decide, well, if I'm going to have bombs dropped on me, I'll go on and continue to fight. It happened in the London Blitz, which finally the Germans had to call it off. It just wasn't working. Anyway, this operation went on up there, and I was assigned to go up with my group of translators, Vietnamese translators, and halfway up the country, they decided they weren't going to go. These were South Vietnamese soldiers, and they just disappeared. They all deserted. And my one guy that I knew came to me and he said, I'm not going north with you either. And I would suggest that you desert too. And I couldn't do that.
So you write also something about, and I wonder whether you think if this applies to today's Army and today's situation. And he said that you wrote something, the American commanders, the people above you as officer grade, had a disinclination to think, possibly an American trait, a kind of fat, dumb, and happy stumbling forward, counting on the wealth and size of the country to make everything come out okay. Do you think that's still the case with the Army, the volunteer Army? And does the experience in Afghanistan that we are now witnessing a very similar one to that of Vietnam many decades earlier. Do you think that's still operative?
Well, the timing is kind of painful that here we are. And after I left Vietnam in 1971, there was 5 more years of fighting that went on, largely, I think, in my candid opinion, to prevent Richard Nixon from being the first president to lose a war. He didn't want to do that. Sorry, just a minute. He didn't want to be the first president to lose a war. And so he was willing to sacrifice any amount of soldiery to make sure that didn't go down on his. I'm sorry, I don't know how to turn this thing off. It'll go off by itself. Little verisimilitude there for you.
Well, Jeff, in relation to that, just what this very thing we're talking about, you talked about being a young journalist interviewing Neil Sheehan after you had gotten back and you were working at a Boston newspaper, and you report that he was extremely depressed, basically, and what he said was something about referring to the blindness, cruelty, in particular American brand of dimness and illogic. And then you asked him about summing up his at the end of the interview, and he said they'll never be able to do that again, in reference to the Vietnam experience. So I throw that to you.
No, Neil Sheehan spent 10 years on that book, and before that he had been a New York Times reporter in Vietnam. He was a brilliant man, a brilliant writer, but his comment, and I wanted to say the name of the book, which you can probably also buy at the Northshire bookstore. Yes.
A Bright Shining Lie.
Bright Shining
Wasn't that
Lie.
it?
Yeah. It's the best. So he said, I asked him, what do you think the war meant? And he said, they'll never be able to do that again. I don't know who he meant by they, but he was wrong. And I think I even said, I'm sorry, Mr. Sheehan, but I think you're wrong. It turns out that, unfortunately, I was right, and he was wrong. It's a business of not only being dim and so on, but refusing to learn from things that are right in front of you. We go into Afghanistan and all the countries in between with the idea that we can make a change and push forward democracy or Christian ethics or whatever it is that we're in favor of. You can't do that. You can't make people do things by pointing guns at them or by dropping bombs on them. I have a feeling that we know that now after this, and I think that probably the toughest decision that Biden has ever made in his life was the idea of getting out of Afghanistan.
So you talk also at one point about the descending sense of hopelessness you felt while you were there, and do you think that might have applied to many of your fellow soldiers and people in the military up and down the ranks?
Right. Yes. The hopelessness was that the killing went on, and everything that we tried all sorts of crazy technological things. Smart bombs were invented during Vietnam, and our radios and helicopters. The general who was in charge, who was a clueless individual who I think only had one major plus in his favor, was that he looked good in a uniform. He looked really. Other than that, he was just as dense as he could be, and he thought that because we had helicopters and we could fly in and insert troops, have a fight, and then we could take the helicopters back out. He thought that was a great advantage, and no one took into consideration the fact that the Russians were making these surface-to-air missiles that would fly up into the turbine of the helicopter and blow the thing out of the sky. It terrorized not only the Vietnamese and the ground troops that had terrorized the pilots, helicopter pilots. And down toward the end, when they were going up into the northern areas to fly ARVN troops in this Operation Limestone, the helicopter pilots would just say, "That's ridiculous. I'm not going to go there. It's not a war. It's suicide."
You do bring up the notion that there was a lot of freelance rejection of orders and general kind of sidestepping all manner of responsibility because of the hopelessness that you talked of earlier. And the sense was it would make no difference whatsoever to sacrifice your life for this. I'll use the word again, hapless venture.
Yes, right. Yeah, I was talking about my experience with the language, and when I got to Vietnam, they put me in charge of a small detachment of about 200 men who would fly up to the front, and they would replace the artillery tubes. There wasn't a front as such in Vietnam. They were just fire bases. They would fly up, and we either take the gun back, or we put a new. The tubes would wear out after a while, and I didn't know anything about this, and it was quite frightening. So I sat down and I said, "This is ridiculous," and I wrote a letter to I'm from Vermont. Wrote a letter to my senator, George Aiken, and lo and behold, a letter came back about 3 weeks later, and said, "Why have you done this?" And they decided that in punishment for me having written a letter to my senator, and worse, having gotten an answer back, they'd teach me. And in a way they did. They assigned me to some horrible infantry units and to the 11th Armored Cavalry, where our mission was to go into the rubber plantations. And this is one of the craziest things. The rubber plantations were still owned and run by the French company Michelin, that makes very good tires. And they had negotiated a settlement with the South Vietnamese government that no American artillery could be fired into the rubber plantations because it knocked the trees over. The trees were worth money, and that was their major, South Vietnam's major cash product was rubber. And so the enemy, once they realized this, it didn't take them long, would go and hide in the rubber plantations, which were square miles, rows and rows upon rows of rubber trees. And the only way that you could get them was to go into these rubber plantations with infantry troops and what they call armored cavalry, and seek them out by running from tree to tree, shooting at people. It was awful. It was the worst kind of fighting I can imagine. But that was negotiated with our government officials in Saigon and the South Vietnamese government.
But you also write about in that chapter on the rubber plantations and fighting in such challenging conditions about the equipment and how the equipment that the troops were given or issued generally produced for were also hapless, that they didn't work, they broke down, they didn't protect, they didn't do any of the advertised benefits of the superior American equipment.
It was not only was it bad stuff, but they knew it was bad stuff. And that wasn't the only thing that really worked fairly well was the helicopters, but even the guns on the helicopters didn't work. And besides, helicopters are not invincible. They can be shot down, and they were shot down. And when you have the idea that you're going to get shot down by either by rifle fire, which doesn't happen too often, but by some kind of rockets or heat-seeking missile, you just avoid the the assignment altogether, and you fly off someplace else.
So, Jeff, there were at the beginning of the book, you write about your dilemma being called up and being drafted, and having as alternatives clearly set out people who would resist the draft and who would go on other ventures to either to Canada or other countries or into hiding. And you have a very compelling and touching rationale for what you did. I'm interested to hear you speak to it.
I guess it was because I had been raised to think that what the United States did was good, and that we were a good people, and that we were bringing democracy and peace and so on to the rest of the world. And I also thought secretly in my own mind that I could outwit the army and stay out of the actual fighting and shooting and killing. I went to the language school, which was a year long, with the idea that the war was going to end. I didn't know anything about the staying power of wars. And then I went into an officer training, which lasted another 6 months, and an assignment back here. And the function was that if you got down to where you owed them less than a year of service, they would not send you to Vietnam. My brother and I were both on orders at the same time. He was an infantry captain, and we didn't know whether they would catch it, but we were both on Vietnam orders, and they sent him back to Korea and me to Vietnam.
Well, to that point, you also write at the very end of the book, one of the last chapters, a series of questions like, what would you do under those circumstances? And it's also very compelling for those of us who had an easier time of it in the military, or never got in, were in the military to begin with, or rejected it. It made for a great deal of self-reflection and reading what you wrote in that particular chapter.
That's right. There is no longer a draft. There is a draft registration, but people are not drafted. And they must now be up against the fact that if the Afghan war is regarded as a failure or a defeat or a screwed up mess, which it sort of is, where are they going to get people to sign up for additional military? Where are they going to get soldiers? I don't know where they're going to get soldiers. I have no idea. So if they try to draft again, would anybody sign up? And I got a little bit philosophical about it. The average young American male, 18 to, let's say, 24, is he going to volunteer? I don't know. Or is he going to volunteer in the numbers that would be required? A lot of them still do. And they're also, when we have the phenomenon of the economic enlistee who enlists because there's no jobs.
Well, I'll submit too. I worked with some people who have been veterans and chiefly have joined the National Guard here in Vermont. And I think what motivates them to join is a sense of solidarity with one another, that there's a community there that is tending to be lacking in normal life for these enlistees. And there's an immense sense of purpose in that, at least. And I think it's divested from any sense of that they're going to be in a war, even though many of them have served many times in Afghanistan or Iraq. but they're proud of it, and in many cases, I understand that quite deeply.
A lot of them are proud of it as long as things are going well.
Yeah, well, they got back.
Yeah, that's right. And things turn. When I was there, it was 1970, and everybody, as I write in the book, I was going to read this one little part of the about the interrelationship between the different groups within the military. If I can do that. In my time, the enlisted men hated the commissioned officers. The draftees hated the enlistees. The junior officers hated majors and above. The lifers hated the civilian contractors. The Army hated the Air Force as flyboys and pansies. The Air Force hated the Army right back as slobs and killers. The infantry hated the rear echelon motherfuckers. Soldiers from rural America hated smartasses from New York and LA. The smartasses hated themselves for being lumped in with goobers and rulers. The draftees hated those who escaped the draft. Escapees hated anyone who reminded them of their cowardly good luck. And of course, blacks and whites, even those who could get along in civilian life, hated each other. I suppose some Protestants hated some Catholics, and somebody had to hate the Jews. So that was our fight. That was our group of fight. That was our unity.
Well, actually, let's see. You also have written, towards the end of the book, and actually the last page of the book, you say, as time goes on and I get older, I am more haunted by my own history and with more questions today than yesterday. So that you wrote that a while, but you still, this is an operative part of your life.
I used to not talk about it at all. And it was something that I just avoided, and nobody wanted to talk about it because, first of all, because it was unpleasant. And you always got the feeling from your fellow Americans that they didn't want to hear about it. They want to leave movies feeling good about what they saw. They didn't want to leave the war. There was no welcome home for just a minute. There was no welcome home. There were no victory plays. There was the benefits that were given to other soldiers were not given to Vietnam veterans. And so we always felt that we were guilty of a mistake, of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and of not having done, whatever it was to ensure a victory. The problem was, of course, is that nobody knew what a victory would be. Nobody knew why we were there. We were fighting communism. As we now know, the Vietnamese didn't give a damn about communism. They didn't want to be communists. They wanted to be Vietnamese. We now see the greatest productive nation on earth is China. And titularly, they are communists, but they didn't want to be that. They are businessmen, and that's what they wanted to be. So where the idea came from that we were fighting communism, as my father once said, the cure for communism was communism. If people wanted to be communists, let them. And then they would decide within a couple of generations that that wasn't really what they wanted.
So I should read something that just serendipitously popped up today and on my computer, a quote from the French writer Maupassant, who said, and I'd love your take on this, Jeff, every government has as much of a duty to avoid war as a ship's captain has to avoid a shipwreck.
Well, this was a shipwreck, and it came out of the I guess the initial president who wanted to have this war go on was John Kennedy. And then Lyndon Johnson didn't want to be seen as abandoning whatever dreams Kennedy had of having been successful in Southeast Asia. But if they had looked at the map, they would have seen that the northern border of North Vietnam was China. And the idea that China, then Mao Zedong, was going to permit a victory anywhere near his country, especially since he had plenty of soldiers that he could send over to fight on endlessly. Mao Zedong once said that the big problem in China was too many Chinese, and so they would have had a war going on for years, decades. But we still went on with this thing without any idea of what the end of it was. Plus, people were making money, and I mentioned this in the book because it was one of the things that shocked me when I found out later. The largest contractor in South Vietnam was a company called RMK, and they built bridges and roads and docks and so on. And one of the great investors in RMK was Lady Bird Johnson, who was Lyndon Johnson's wife. So it wasn't that whatever her goal was, they were making money. And until the money ran out, they were going to continue to do that. There's the sad thing was that people who were in the government were willing to see it go forward, willing to see this war go forward year after year after year, so that people like Michelin and Lady Bird Johnson and all sorts of other, and the Chase Manhattan Bank, wouldn't have their revenue stream interrupted. And we didn't make any money. I mean, the soldiers that were in the field were making nothing. Even the generals weren't making very much money. So I talk about that a good deal. The funniest thing, of course, was that I was assigned once to get a roster of soldiers together to take them down to Saigon for the Bob Hope show. And people of a certain venue, of a certain age, will not remember who Bob Hope was, and good for them. Bob Hope was this sort of mild, smart guy comedian who went to entertain the troops. And by 1970, everybody hated him because he was just something that the command had thought up, and nobody wanted to go to see Bob Hope, which if in fact Bob Hope had come and there was nobody there for an audience, so we had to order these people to go down to Saigon and go to Bob Hope and laugh. And he would stand out on the stage and tell some stupid jokes, and he had some Raquel Welch and some other girls. I don't know what it was. I don't know who thought that was funny or how that raised our fighting spirit, but it didn't.
Well,
To that question. Oh, go ahead, Ed.
Well, to that point, you also in the book opine that American humor at present, meaning your contribution to it, is as vicious and destructive as any in the world. But the 50s and 60s, that is time of Bob Hope, and later, the Americans were relatively gentle in their application of sarcasm and ridicule.
Right. People were surprised by, Lenny Bruce, for example, and even George Carlin. They were surprised when these guys came along, and underneath our kind of placid sense of humor, there was this a great many things, which, because things had gone wrong, they were promised were going to go right, they were ready to hear stronger criticism. And we did things that were just so, in some ways, so ridiculous. I talk about the operation that I was involved in, called the Wandering Soul.
Oh, yeah. Mm.
We thought, and I think later it turned out to be not true, but we thought that in the Vietnamese mind or in the Vietnamese culture, if you were killed somewhere away from your home village, your soul would wander forever through the jungles or the mountains or wherever. And as your soul wandered along, it would yell and scream and call out for help. So somebody came up with the idea that we could make something that sounded like the screaming and wailing of a wandering soul and play it from helicopters and over areas where we thought there were Vietnamese enemy. And then they would be reminded that they didn't want to be there, and they would either leave or they would desert, or they would decide not to go on. And so we did this, and we had a woman in Saigon who was a translator, and she made a soul a tape of this wandering soul screaming that it wanted to go home and it didn't know how. Blah, blah, blah. And we hung these big speakers on the bottom of a helicopter and played this tape. And it turned out it didn't really work because you could also hear the helicopter, and nobody thought about that part. Not only that, but it scared the hell out of the South Vietnamese troops who were on our side, and they didn't want to die in the jungle either. I mean, it was ridiculous on an almost world-class level.
Question for both of you. Before everyone else came in, when we were talking, you had both taken a moment to talk about the wording on the Zippo on the cover. And it reads, "We are the unwilling, led by the unqualified, doing the unnecessary for the ungrateful." Could you speak to that a little bit?
I don't know who wrote that. It's a great summing up of exactly what the situation is. And in a lot of cases, I would think that even the troops that are now fighting in places like Afghanistan and Somalia and so on and so forth, probably some of them could say, well, you know, that's just about right. We are the unwilling. We were drafted. And we were led by the unqualified. And General Westmoreland didn't know what the hell he was doing. Doing the unnecessary for the ungrateful. The last part, the ungrateful, is the hardest thing to stomach, because the American people were just not interested in victory or anything. A great many of them did not know, as I didn't know, where Vietnam was. And I'd never heard of it as a country. And I didn't know that had no idea why this was important. And for that matter, it really wasn't important. But those lines on the Zippo lighter, I will also point out that I was talking to somebody who said that, well, younger person, I don't like to sing about young people, who said, well, what is that thing, the Zippo lighter? And I had to explain that it was a cigarette lighter. And they actually had not recognized it right away as a cigarette lighter, possibly because people don't smoke as much as they used to.
Jeff, did anybody ever thank you for your service?
Yes, a lot of people did. I mean, there's always been a kind of a pro forma thank you for your service. I don't know what it means. Thank God you did it and I didn't have to, is what it means.
Yes.
I think that's what it means. Yeah.
Everyone, we have time for some audience questions. So if you have any questions for our author, you can type them in the chat. And while we're waiting for those, I actually have a question also. Jeff, I wondered if your experiences that you described in this book informed your work as a political cartoonist once you came back, and if so, how?
Yes, I think they do. I don't have the patience with politicians that I might have had. I know what happens when people don't work to maintain peace, and it's hard work. I mean, it's a great deal of talking, a great deal of traveling, a great deal of diplomacy, and in some cases you really get very tired doing that. I'm sure that people like, well, Senator Kerry, who lost the election because a group of, what would they call them, swift boat soldiers ran after him.
Yeah.
Vietnam service. I think that must have been hard to accept. And I think most people, when they think of the soldiers out there fighting on the line, they don't think of really how difficult it is, how lonely it is, and in some cases how what could be done to make it easier, make it more pleasant. It's not pleasant. I mean, armies do two things: they kill people and they blow things up. That's all. And to make them, give them other missions, such as ensuring fighting for democracy or pushing the American way of life or something else like that. It's really impossible, and it's proven that it can't be done.
So I just received one in my direct messages asking, was the experience of writing long form memoir harder than writing for cartoons in the past?
Yeah, yes, it is. It's not that it's hard. It's just that you, in a political cartoon, you draw it, you put in a few words, you send it off, it's gone. If it's wrong, you can correct it tomorrow. But long form, you have to write, and then you go back and read it, and then you read it again, and then you start to think of other things that you could put in. So it's a great process, but it takes a stick-to-itiveness that I probably don't have. I like to do things and get it over with.
I mean, you did in this case. Can you tell us how long this process took?
In a way, it took 40 or 50 years, because I've been thinking about it every day. And as I was saying before, I didn't talk about it to a great many people. I sort of kept it in. I've never been to any of the veterans organizations, the VFW or the American Legion, because when you go in there, you start to hear people talking about great things that they had done, and you wonder, did that really happen, or is it just something that happens after 3 or 4 beers?
So we are just about out of time this evening, but I wondered actually if you both could tell us a little bit what your work life has been like through this pandemic year. Whether you've had a productive year of cartooning, or if it's been a tough one, and what that's been like for you both.
Ed, what's your life been like?
Oddly enough, the pandemic has just in a contradictory way sharpened my work life, because it's made it far more conducive to the solitude and contemplation that really is at the heart of at least my work. I'm not as engaged politically as Jeff. We have converging but parallel, as they say, practices. But in my case, folly never stops. As Lily Tomlin has said, in my case, of what I focus on, the more cynical I get, I can never keep up. So,
yeah, no matter how cynical I get, I can't keep up.
Yeah, so I'm sure it's the same with all of us. But but other than the sorrow and the sadness and the kind of cataclysmic aspect of our society and those who have been touched by the pandemic, I'm, being solitary and not going anywhere really, except one studio. It's been quite productive in a funny way, a contradictory way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think if you're not interrupted by anything, you can, and it turns out that the work that you have to do is really all that you do, besides getting up and getting something to eat. You actually do get a great deal of work done. Plus, this was a new for political cartoon. This was a new story. We had never had a pandemic, a total shutdown of the country, and in a way, it probably made coming up with something humorous or even darkly humorous all that more necessary.
Yeah, and in my case, the social fallout from the pandemic has been something I've been interested in and been using as my subject, such as the fact that people are home a lot and their pets are happier for that, and the people are leaving cities and have adapted new lifestyles having to do with virtual work patterns. These things are, the social aspect of it is what's really interested me. And I've been working with, even though I don't venture forth very much. And therefore it's been perfectly normal in that sense at least.
I think the only other difference is that I feel for when I'm in an airport and stationed someplace and I see some young soldiers going through on their way to some assignment at either some base in the United States or overseas. I feel for them, and if I can, I try to buy them lunch or at least somehow let them know that we do appreciate them, and to be not just brave, but to be patient, because we do need armies. Unfortunately, we do need navies, and I guess somebody needs the Air Force. I don't know, not me.
Jeff, Ed, thank you both so much. The book is Lieutenant Dangerous, a Vietnam War memoir. You can get it at Northshire Bookstore, and the link in the chat. Thank you both so much. This has been a wonderful evening, a wonderful conversation between two of you. Thank you so much. And everyone,
my pleasure.
Bye. Ed, I'll give you a call.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, we're off.
Take care.
Thank you and have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.